let's first ask ourselves, what was the point of financial globalization? Why would all of us jump in and open our capital accounts and say we'll let everybody in and out and so on? Because we thought this would give us more capital for investment, right? That was the whole idea, that we need to invest much more and our domestic savings won't be enough, so we need foreign savings, and that way we will invest much more. That was the idea. What has actually happened? Our investment rate in India has been falling since 2010, okay? What about all these other countries? Most of the other countries that did this financial globalization, that entered the global financial markets, have not increased their investment rates. Most of them, again, big declines. Malaysia, Indonesia, massive declines in investment rates. And we end up paying more in terms of what we lose. It's called a seigniorage losses. It's very important. Let me explain it. It's actually a very serious point. So, we allow money to come in and we then end up putting money outside, right? The money that comes in charges us a lot of interest because we're such a risky country. We're a poor country and we're risky. So let's say in US, you would get an interest rate of 1%, 2%, 3%. In India, it would be 8%, 10%, 12%, right? So they get a lot higher return because of the supposed risk. Meanwhile, we have all this money in foreign exchange reserves, or our rich people who put their money abroad, yeah? They get very low returns. Our average return on the assets we send abroad is 2%. So we're losing money in this process, right? We're getting all this money as inflow, and then we're sending out as outflow. And so there's a difference of 10% to 2%, right? Big gap. That amounts to more than 2% of GDP. Every year we are losing 2% of GDP, okay? Just to put it in perspective, 2% of GDP is double all the health spending of center and states. Total central and state public health spending is 0.9% of GDP. So we are losing in just this capital coming in and out, which we're not using for our investment. We are losing double of what we could have. We could have tripled health spending in India. Think of that. Yeah? And we know we underfund health, right? We know that people don't have access to basic health care. We could have done that. So we haven't gained from financial globalization. The idea that you had to do it, rubbish. Okay? Most economies in the world have lost. Fortunately, we don't have a big debt problem. At the moment, only Mr. Adani does, but India doesn't. Okay? But many countries do, and they're stuck with it. Now, you're really caught. Once you have a big external debt problem, you're really stuck. You have very little that you can do. So what did you gain from that? So definitely, yes, we should do financial de-globalization. Can we do it? Yes, because they're doing it themselves, if you see what I mean. They themselves are saying, well, you put your foreign exchange reserves in my country, but I've decided I don't like you anymore, so I'm just going to freeze your assets. I won't give you access to your own money. It's a bit like a sort of global demonetization, basically saying, you've got your account in my bank, but that's it. It's mine now. That is not a way in which you encourage a lot of countries to actually either rely on the dollar or rely on this global movement of finance. So I think the way in which the trade and technology war with China, similarly, the ways it's going, more and more countries will say, well, let's hedge our bets. Let's not get too involved and integrated with anyone, because at any moment something can come up and shift all of that. So I think we will get more financial deglobalization, and I think it's a damn good thing. So all of these are things that we have discovered about recessions since that major global crash. So how did the global economy recover from that crash? It didn't. If I tell you honestly, it didn't actually recover in the full sense. In other words, if we look at output, global economic activity, in the period since 2009, the rate of growth of economic activity has come down to about half of what it was in the period before, the period that led up to the crash. And particularly, some economies have recovered much less than others. Now, in fact, China, India, we were supposed to be the ones that recovered the fastest. And China definitely recovered the fastest. But in India, our recovery has been rather unusual. We got a recovery in GDP, but we didn't get a recovery in employment. In fact, all the data we have suggest that our absolute employment numbers have fallen between 2011-12 and 2017-18. In other words, that last decade, when we were supposedly growing well, was a period when we were not creating more jobs. We had less paid jobs than we had before. So a different kind of recovery. But how did the advanced economies recover? What happened to the rich world? They recovered basically by what you would call blood transfusions. Yeah? The patient was injected with all this liquidity. What is liquidity? It's a lot more money in the system. So the US Central Bank, it's called the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, they started pushing money into banks. They allowed the banks to increase their holdings of assets massively, which meant that they could lend more. That was the idea, that you're going to infuse money into these banks and allow them to lend more and therefore revive economic activity. Since this period started, every year the US Federal Reserve was pushing $2 trillion, $3 trillion, $4 trillion into the system every year. Every month it would be at least 100 trillion, sometimes 150 trillion, 250 trillion, depending on the need, would be inserted into the banks and the financial companies. And that's really how the system kept afloat. Now, what do banks do when they have all this money? They lend out to others, right? And so you got a massive increase in debt of every category, of workers, of households, of companies. Everybody's debt increased. And in the rich countries, it was also student debt, it was debt to buy things, consumer credit, it was education debt, it was health debt, it was debt to buy houses. Companies took on debt to go and invest elsewhere in the world. Basically, you got a massive explosion of debt. And this is true also in the developing world. So when you get financial companies who've been given huge amounts of money at very low interest rates, yeah, the interest rates came down to 0.06% was the interest rate in the US at a time, which really means negative if you account for price rise, right? So you're really paying nothing for all of this money. So you have all this money sloshing around the globe, looking for places to invest. And suddenly, therefore, developing countries who had been receiving some money but not that much became very attractive. They're called emerging markets, yes? What's an emerging market? A developing country that has integrated with global finance. And emerging is a polite way of saying, we like you now. Now we're going to give you money. And so you have much more money flowing into emerging markets. And you even have what are called frontier markets, okay, which were markets that nobody would look at before because they were seen as too risky. So in sub-Saharan Africa, conflict-ridden countries in Asia, countries that never could get access to global finance suddenly also became attractive. They were frontier markets. So all this money sloshing around the globe, creating debt, which should be all fine, except that when you need just a little bit of a change in expectations for this money to go rushing back. Okay? Remember we saw this with the global financial crisis. It was a crisis in the US, yet because it changes people's expectations, money goes back to the US. That's exactly what happened again during the pandemic. Okay? You get a major global crisis that hadn't been, well, I won't say that no one expected it, but no one expected it exactly then at that time, shall we say. So you got a massive health crisis that was spreading across the globe. And for a change, it also was a health crisis that affected the rich countries. Okay? And as a result, you got the financial markets in panic. Once again, you had a massive outflow suddenly in March 2020. Then they said, okay, maybe they're all right, they're back to inflow in April. Then again, another outflow in September, then maybe an inflow in December. They went crazy. They were very uncertain and worried. But meanwhile, all these countries, these emerging markets, frontier markets, had taken on debt because it was so cheap. In our country, it wasn't the government that took on debt, but we had private players who took on a lot of debt. We know their names, we know what's going on with some of them. So there's always a problem when you take on too much debt. But many developing countries found that suddenly they couldn't access the same debt. And suddenly, therefore, you have a problem because you have to repay a lot of money in debt service, in interest payments and things like that. And then you're not able to get foreign exchange. Because the pandemic period, exports came down, services like tourism, things that gave you foreign exchange before, that money is coming down. A lot of countries got less remittances, so that money is coming down. So how do you actually manage? How do you repay? Many countries started experiencing debt crises. Now the pandemic went on for at least 1.5 years, as we know, in terms of restricting economic activity. And when you're restricting economic activity, your GDP is not growing. That makes it even harder for you to deal with all of these external problems. But the big feature about the pandemic, the most defining feature to me, is not how sudden it was or how fatal it was or how terrible it was, but just how unequal it showed the world to be. So the rich countries, first of all, they grabbed the vaccines and then they prevented production of these vaccines elsewhere in the world, were able to actually appropriate 85% of all vaccine production in 2021. And everybody else had to struggle with whatever they could make, which is why even in India, our vaccine program started later than it should have, which is why we had such a terrible second wave, the Delta wave, as you know. But in addition to the vaccine grabbing and the unequal access to vaccines, the biggest and most reprehensible sign of inequality was the fiscal response, by which I mean how much government spending changed as a result of the pandemic. So we had a massive difference in how the advanced economies responded and how emerging markets and low-income countries responded, okay? So the rich countries decided that now we can spend. This is after decades of saying, no, governments can't spend more, we can't have fiscal deficits, it's very unsafe. What we can do is increase money supply. This is what they've been saying, right, for a decade. Suddenly you discover you can spend. And they spent like anything. Between 10% to 30% of GDP they spent. So just to give you one indicator, the US between January 2020 and March 2021 spent almost $30,000 per person. Additional government spending, additional. That's the kind of increase that we saw in the US public spending to counter the pandemic. By contrast, developing countries didn't dare spend that much, partly because we were worried about capital flight. You know, you have a large fiscal deficit, and then the rating agency says, no, that's very bad, we have to downgrade you, and then there will be capital flight. So the middle-income countries spent between 4 and 6% of GDP, not between 10 and 30%, much less. The low-income countries couldn't spend because anyway they had debt problems, anyway they had lost exports, anyway they couldn't afford to import more. So they spent between 2 and 4% of GDP only. So what does that mean in comparative terms? I told you, the US was spending $30,000 per person more in that period. The low-income countries spent $2 more per person. $2 over that entire period, additional. So that tells you what the difference was. Now, what does it mean? It means obviously there will be much later economic recovery in these countries. It means there will be longer time before employment comes back, longer time before you can even do the health spending that you feel is so necessary in a pandemic, yeah? Many countries continue to spend more on repaying debt than they could spend on health and all of the basic things you need to do to deal with in a pandemic. So it's a very unequal world, okay, post-pandemic, and it's got more unequal. Within that inequality, of course, there is the inside country inequality, which has got even worse, because we know in each country the very rich got even richer and most of the rest of the population got poorer. Okay, so that was the other feature. Some companies, digital companies especially, benefited hugely, okay, because everybody started doing everything digitally, right? Whether it's e-commerce or you're doing all your entertainment through Netflix or whatever, all the activity moved to that area. So the digital companies got very rich, but also the extremely rich individuals also got very rich. How could that happen when the whole world is in a crisis, when economies are downsliding? Because finance continued to demand its pound of flesh from everyone and continued to get it. Okay? So the financial elite, the very, very rich individuals who control global finance, they continue to get their money. The very rich entrepreneurs, the Elon Musks and Bill Gates and others, continue to remain very rich and get richer. Our own extremely rich, our two Mr. A's and others also continued to get very rich and even richer. Of course, the biggest increase in wealth was the one who has come down most recently. Mr. Adani, Gautam Adani's wealth increased 100-fold over this period. It's coming down to more realistic levels now. But the basic tendency was massive inequality. Now, this is a context in which you get the Ukraine war. So yes, Russia should never have invaded Ukraine. It's a terrible act of aggression. But the US response was to say, we are going to impose sanctions, and we are going to insist that we can just freeze the assets of any country who does things that we don't like. So there were trade sanctions, and there was the freezing of assets, like Russian central bank assets in the United States, and the assets of some Russian oligarchs who were close to Mr. Putin. How did that change everything? Well, the one big thing that happened because of the Ukraine war that affected the rest of the world was the massive increase in gas and food prices. And everyone said, oh, it's because of the Ukraine war. Yeah? Russia is a major fuel exporter. It's a big oil and natural gas exporter. And Russia and Ukraine together produce a lot of wheat, and they export wheat. And Russia is a big exporter of fertilizer. So obviously, all of these prices will go up. That's what everyone said. Well, it turns out that that wasn't the real reason. We're all told that prices rose because of the Ukraine war. But now we know prices didn't rise because of the Ukraine war. Prices rose because there was profiteering by the big companies who sell these things. And there was financial speculation in global commodity markets that made the price rise even faster and faster. And now this is well documented. We know that the big beneficiaries of this were petroleum companies and the big agribusinesses who control wheat prices, okay? Not related to the war, because the supply, the global supply of oil and wheat didn't change. Very different from what you read in the newspapers, right? In the newspapers, we kept hearing, oh my God, the supply is going to be affected because of the war. It turns out, no. The supply remained the same. Prices shot up. Prices went up, bam, like that, okay, between January and July, and they came down again, so that by November, they were back to the levels of the pre-war. Nothing had changed in global supply. This was entirely driven by companies raking it in, getting excess profits, on the back of everybody believing that prices have to go up because supply has changed, okay? Now, this is fine. It's bad news for the rest of the world and for people who have to pay more for food and fuel. But it would be fine if you could then say, well, this is inflation that is driven by these price increases in basic goods, right? Fuel enters everything, production and distribution of everything. So if the price of fuel goes up, all other prices will go up. And food is a basic need. Food, wheat prices, basic food, everybody is going to need it. So if those prices go up, obviously other prices will go up. Right? That's why you got inflation. That's why you got higher prices in the advanced economies and in other countries. And then, of course, there were these supply constraints because of COVID. Because China had still been closed, a lot of the things China used to produce, it weren't so easily available, so those prices also went up. But that's really all. These were all supply issues. So, in fact, if the policy had recognized that these are supply issues and firms making excess profits, then the policy should have been to say, well, all right, we stop them making the excess profits. We tax away all these super profits that they have made by profiting off people's tragedies, okay? And we do something about the supply bottlenecks. That should have been the policy response. Instead, what is the policy response of the advanced economies? Oh, inflation is up, so we have to raise interest rates. And we have to tighten money supply. Now, why is that? That's because of a very old and a very false belief that inflation is always the result of too much money supply. Okay? Now, that's simply not true. It was never true, but it is even less true today. Okay? Inflation, when you think about excess money supply, didn't I tell you that there was this massive increase in money supply after 2009? Between 2010 and 2020, global injections of money, especially by the advanced economy banks, yeah, was in the excess of $32 trillion. $32 trillion was the amount of money flooding the system. Did it give you increased prices? No. Okay? Because demand was still low. It didn't act, all it did was give you this money moving around the globe, trying to generate more profits and getting more and more countries indebted and more sectors indebted. But once the prices started rising, and they were rising for supply reasons, right? Not for demand reasons. What's the response of the central banks? Oh, prices are going up, we will have to raise interest rates to cut down on demand. Because demand is too high. That's why the prices are going up. And so that's what has happened. We've had the biggest increase in interest rates in the US and in the ECB in a short period. That is to say, there have been big interest rate increases before, but this has been very rapid. You know, every month, bam, 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 bam. So much more, so much more, so much more. So suddenly, it's getting more and more expensive to borrow. And for the rest of the world, US has become a more attractive place to keep your money. So here are all these developing countries who had taken on debt when interest rates were low and when they were almost begged to take on the debt. Yes? And now you have all these multiple whammies. You have the pandemic, you have the impact of the Ukraine war in terms of the rising prices of food and fuel, which were because of profiteering and because of commodity speculation. Okay? And now you have the US raising interest rates and Europe raising interest rates. So all of the global capital wants to go back to these safe havens. And that means that once again, there's capital outflow from these countries. Even a country like India, which until recently was seen as the big, great hope, yeah? Our net capital flows are in the period until just last month, before the Adani fiasco, were negative. We were losing capital. Why? Because always the US is the preferred home of all of this. So now that capital is going back to the US, what's the purpose of this monetary policy? They say it explicitly. The purpose is to cause output to come down, economic activity to slow down, unemployment to increase. Why? Because you want wages to come down. The only way to bring wages down is to make unemployment increase. Why do you want wages to come down? Because wages are causing inflation. But wages are not causing inflation, you say. It's profits that are causing inflation. No, never mind. We have to bring wages down if we want to bring down inflation. So in the US and in Europe, what is happening? This is, in a sense, it's kind of class war in these areas, okay? It's class war. It is basically saying you spent too much during the pandemic and workers got a better deal, and that's no good. We can't allow that. So we have to actually now bring out a situation where you generate a recession, you instigate a recession to cause workers to get less money, because that's how we're going to bring down inflation. Now, they probably know it's not about bringing down inflation. They probably know that it's about this class war in a way. But the interesting thing is that while they might be worried about the domestic response, They're not looking at all about what this has in terms of the impact on the rest of the world. So they are announcing that, yes, we are going to raise our interest rates. And in fact, President Biden even said it. We know that this will have a bad effect on other countries, but we can't help it. We have to do what we have to do. Really? You're raising interest rates to harm your own workers, but you are also harming the rest of the world massively. So now here's the funny thing. What's the likely outcome of this? Because the US has spent so much already, and because it's continuing to spend more, the public spending is still very high, it probably won't have a recession. It probably will continue on a reasonable rate without major unemployment increases, especially as now they are beginning to taper off the interest rate increases. But the rest of the world, we are the ones who are going to get the recession, okay? We are the ones who are going to end up with global trade slowing. All the predictions are that global trade will grow at maybe half the rate it grew before in the previous year, with investments not coming to us, going instead back to the US and maybe Europe, and with all of the other safety nets that we had disappearing, okay? That's the rest of the world, broadly speaking, not just India. Especially those countries that already had debt problems. So I already told you, right, that many countries in the world got into big debt problems because of the pandemic, who were chugging along nicely. They had taken on lots of debt, maybe too much debt, but they were planning on repaying according to their schedule. But then the pandemic comes, then you don't have export earnings, you don't get remittances from workers abroad, you don't get tourism revenues, so you can't have the foreign exchange to actually pay some of your debt. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates that 58 countries are currently in severe debt distress. About 6 countries have already defaulted. Okay, Sri Lanka, as we know, our neighbor, has defaulted. Ghana has defaulted. A bunch of other countries have defaulted. Morocco has defaulted. So there are already countries that have defaulted. But there are another 20 or 25 countries who are just teetering on the edge. Not yet in severe distress, but likely to be in severe distress. You would think that anyone could have seen this coming, that you have a large lot of debt, you're creating a situation where people don't earn foreign exchange, they don't earn dollars, they're going to find it difficult to repay. So you'll have to reduce that debt. That should have been the response. And to be fair, they recognized that that has to be the response. So they created a fund. First, they did just a postponement of the debt. They said, okay, don't pay for the next year any of the payments. But then at the end of that year, you still have to pay, right? So then they said, all right, we will set up a process whereby we will try and reduce your debt. So they created a system. It's called the Common Framework. The Common Framework, which the G20 countries created, where the public creditors, bilateral, the international financial institutions, and the private creditors will all come together and agree to reduce the debt. Good idea, right? Sounds like finally they realized that this is a problem. Well, turns out that this common framework was started 2 years ago. Till today, not a single country has benefited. So one country that applied was Chad. It had to wait. It kept waiting. Then when oil prices went up, they were told, oh, now you don't need it. So you don't have to get the common framework. Then when the, oh, I should stop now. Yes, but let me just finish this point. Then when the another country tried to approach them, they're too busy arguing among themselves. Who's going to take a cut? You have to take a bigger haircut than I will. The World Bank and the IMF are saying, we won't take any debt reduction. You guys do the debt reduction. Countries like Sri Lanka, which is in a deep distress at the moment, they're still arguing about who is going to actually cut the debt. These are the same institutions that encourage Sri Lanka to take on all these foreign loans, international sovereign bonds, with private creditors from all over. And when they are hitting a problem, they're saying, no, too bad. We will think about it, but we won't reduce our debt. Let somebody else reduce it. What does it mean? It frankly means that we are in a bit of a global mess. And it also means that it's really the rest of the world that is facing a recession. So are we facing a global recession? If you count a large part of humanity, yes. Are we facing a global recession in terms of the major economies of the world? Probably not. But will the fact that a large part of humanity is impacted by recession, hunger, unemployment, economic distress, will that come back to hit the advanced countries? Yes, it will. So I guess the real point is, will the advanced countries learn from this and actually do something to solve the problem? I don't think so. Until then, all of us will have to be looking after ourselves. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sure there will be questions.
Hello.
Is it possible to have some light so we can see everyone? Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Next, the floor is open for questions now. We'll have another 15 to 20 minutes for questions. We'll take like 5 to 6 questions now.
Good evening, ma'am. And you are awesome. You had given an awesome speech on one of our neighbors, Sri Lanka also. Yeah. And at the same time, our another neighbor, Pakistan, there the value of rupees in Pakistan had depreciated a lot. That makes $1 is equal to more than 200 Pakistani rupees. So what is the reason behind that, ma'am?
Yeah, Pakistan is actually a very interesting and a tragic case. So in some ways you can blame internal Pakistan political economy, which has been, very rough and very adverse for the political instability, the elites and so on. But you can also blame the IMF. Pakistan has been almost continuously under IMF. Yeah, it's always had more or less one way or the other, some IMF program or the other. And each time the IMF tells it to do certain things, it does those things and things get worse for the economy. So a lot of what the IMF recommends for Pakistan is really not good either for the economy or the people. In the latest round, right now, they are desperate. They have 1.5 months of imports worth of foreign reserves left. And they have gone to the IMF saying, okay, whatever it is, we'll accept all your conditions. But you know what they're asking? They're saying, well, look, you give free electricity to the poorest people. You can't give that. You have to make them pay for electricity. These are people who cannot afford food anymore. You're telling them they have to pay for electricity. They said, you brought in a law to restrict imports of luxury items for the rich. You can't do that. You have to open up all imports. Really? I mean, yes. So I would say Pakistan has done a lot of domestic mismanagement, but it has been made much worse by the IMF's approach to what should be resolving these problems.
Actually, after that Russian-Ukraine war, I can see that some countries prefer rupees for international transactions. So what benefits does it make to our country?
This is a very interesting thing that is happening in the world. The fact that there are these trade sanctions that are imposed against Russia. So in some ways, India benefited, or shall I say one company in India benefited, because we were importing the raw oil from Russia and then we were exporting it to Europe. And so countries like Germany actually got around the sanctions that way. They said, we're not importing from Russia, we're only importing from India. The fact is that India was importing from Russia and then processing it and sending it on to Germany. So this was one way of avoiding the sanctions. But there is another thing that has happened because of all of these sanctions and the freezing of assets, which is that more and more countries are realizing, listen, you can't be so dependent on the dollar system. You never know when that will just stop, when you won't be allowed to do something. So many more countries are thinking of alternative routes. So India, Russia, it's almost like a barter trade. It's, rubles or rupees. India is doing that with a bunch of Middle Eastern countries now. China is doing that with many countries, doing renminbi trade. more and more countries are thinking of alternative ways of going around this dollar payment system, simply because if you're very reliant on it, it can stop any time.
Madam, before this pandemic,
Yes.
the Western world ruled the interest rate in negative. Now it is single digit. Do you think that in the future the interest rate will go to double digit? Thinking that the China and India are going away from dollar trade.
That's a very interesting question. I don't think it would hit dollar double digits in the near future, certainly not in the next 4 or 5 years. Why? Because that would make a lot of economic activity unsustainable in the US, okay? And already you've noticed they've said we are going to increase, but at a lower rate. Earlier they would increase by 75 basis points. Now they're saying, okay, we'll reduce it by 25 basis points. So they're bringing down the rate of increase. See, 0 or 1% is too low, agreed. But I don't think they're going to let it go above 6 in the near future, because a lot of their own industries will collapse.
Okay.
Yeah? Keeping the dollar as the main source, right? Now, they need to do that. But the funny thing is, so there was an economist called Charles Kindleberger. He had this thing that, money is about power. International money is about international power. And so as long as the US remains the most powerful state, then the dollar will continue to command stability. And let's face it, there's no alternative. Right? The euro is not an alternative, renminbi is not an alternative, so people will continue to hold the dollar. But the more that the US does these other things, like freezing assets, the more people will say, well, maybe we diversify our reserves, we'll hold them in other currencies, we'll think of other finance routes, we'll think of other ways to trade. Because increasingly, every central bank governor in the developing world and every finance minister must be thinking, how much can I rely on the US? So let's just think of alternatives.
So going away from dollar as an international transaction currency for India is a good thing.
It's not easy. I don't think it can happen just like that. But already you can see that India is going in some of that direction. It's diversifying some of its actions, yeah? So morality, let's face it, economics has no morals, right? I mean, no, I'm serious. Economics has no morals. And economists also mostly don't have morals, let's also admit. but the economic processes that we've seen, and we are seeing still, it's not just about morality, it's also about, as you say, power, but it's also about a certain group trying to expand its power. So this very famous financier, George Soros, you would have heard of him, he's a major financial player. He says, it's a class war, and it's my class that's winning. He says as much. He says what's going on now is class war. It's the rich, large capitalists in finance, in fuel, in pharma, in digital, they are exerting their power, and there's nobody to push back. That's the problem, right? So if you say, where's the morality, we don't have the morality because people are not responding to that. It's because we are letting it happen, yeah? We means all of us, really. We're all saying, well, okay, this is the way it's going to play out. There isn't enough of an outcry that, let's say, governments say, we will not allow these companies to make excess profits. It's a simple thing. It's not difficult. You know that they have made 3 times the profit they've made in the average of the last 5 years. Tax that. Yeah, it's a very simple thing. It's not such a big deal. Why doesn't that happen? Because not enough noise is made about it. Because the oil companies have a big lobby, and they can impress the Biden government, and they're not facing any pushback from people. People are not saying, how dare you not tax those petrol companies, right? In India, similarly, we get a budget that says we are not going to increase any of the things that matter for people. The employment scheme, health, agriculture, education. We're not going to spend any money on that. In fact, we're going to reduce the money on all those things. Where's the outcry? What do you get instead on the front pages of every newspaper? Best budget ever, so wonderful, 11 on 10, you know. So, in a sense, it's because we don't push back. We shouldn't expect morality from, large capital or people in power. We should expect them to respond to popular pressure. So until we create that popular pressure, they're going to behave the way they do, Yeah, I think you want to add to that. Yeah. We can't hear you then.
So essentially, until and unless the democratic institutions respond, nothing really can be fundamentally done about it. So how gloomy of a future are we looking at from now? Because a lot of us are like master students from just MSc. And we're doing all of these things and we're concerned about to a certain extent,
Yes.
a few of us. How gloomy is the future? Like just right off the bat, can these things, I don't think they'll be able to ever resolve, at least in our lifetime, but eventually is there any hope? And what is the role of economics in it?
Okay, so big questions there. Is there any hope? Yes, there is hope. Certainly in your lifetime, absolutely, I promise you there is hope. Okay? Maybe not in mine because I'm really old. But what is the role of economics? So remember, economics is about politics. It's power. Economics is not this neutral, technical thing that has its own laws. There are laws of the economy, but they are shaped by power, by institutions, and by what society does. So yes, it is up to us to change these. You're saying until everything happens, but things don't happen all at once. It isn't one big fell swoop and everything gets changed. These things happen in different ways. And what I have seen in my many decades now is that change comes not from the direction that you're looking for it. So we don't always have to think that, okay, we expect change in this way and it's not coming in this way, and so it's never going to come. Change happens in all kinds of unexpected ways. The point is to be able to seize those opportunities and demand that governments actually respond to the people. Now, honestly, you guys are here in Tamil Nadu, it is, as a state government, is much more responsive than many other state governments. Not because necessarily that it wants to be, but because the people of Tamil Nadu will not allow it not to be. Yeah? You will demand a public library like this. You will demand 4,500 public libraries across the state. How many other states will citizens say, you've got to give us public libraries? How many other places will you have primary health centers that are functioning all the time with doctors and nurses in them? And it's not, yes, it's because it's, a government that is, but it's because the people are saying, you have to deliver these to us. So a lot depends on how people respond. And it's not inevitable that we're stuck with what we're stuck with. Yeah? Everything can be changed. All of this, everything I've described to you nationally and globally is the product of human beings. So if human beings did it, human beings can undo it. Yeah? And it will happen, certainly in your lifetime, especially with all of you around to push for it.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Abdul Rahman, UPSC aspirant. I don't have any technical question, but a very basic question. As we were discussing about the employment, today is an era of AI. How will the AI will have an impact on employment? Especially after ChatGPT recent news.
So, if you leave everything to the markets, that is, you don't do public intervention and so on, then yeah, I think AI will be quite devastating on employment. You can think of all kinds of things. I was teaching at a journalism school today, this Asian College of Journalism. I don't know how many of these students will be needed to write articles anymore if ChatGPT can write such excellent articles, So yes, there is an impact. But, remember that human history has been full of labor-saving devices. Full. The whole of human history is a story of more and more labor-saving devices. And yet, there has been employment growth. Why is that? Because there are different things that you can do. Now, it doesn't happen on its own. So what's happening with, let's say, the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence and all of that, is that it's certain people who control the technology are making massive profits, right? Now, the sensible thing to do would be to tax some of those profits and use that money to invest in things that are employment generating. Which are the things that are employment generating? Care industries. We completely underfund care. Yeah? We assume that most care will be done at home, unpaid by women. And when they are paid, then they're not paid properly, pathetic. We don't value, we don't give them respect, and we don't give them remuneration. If we actually did that, that's hugely employment generating, okay? Creative industries. There will never be a world in which human beings don't want new things for entertainment, for pleasure, for creativity. And if you can actually fund some of that, that improves the quality of life. That is also employment generating. And people can use AI to be creative as well, right? So you shouldn't see technology as a threat. It's only a threat because of capitalism. And they want you to see it as a threat because they want to scare the hell out of you so you won't dare ask for your rights, okay? We should see technology as enabling, but technology has to be used and the fruits of technology have to be shared. Yeah? Which basically means you have to have public intervention. You can't leave it to just markets and the rich people who control big companies to decide. You have to let a responsible and responsive government. So remember, both are important. I don't know at the national level whether we have either, but we need a responsible and responsive government to actually make sure that these gains from technology are widely spread. Yeah? So, don't fear it. I mean, I was shown today a wonderful reading room for the children in this library. And apparently there's this sort of virtual reality bit that they go and they have dinosaurs next to them and so on. It's fun. Why not? Yeah? This is AI assisting something else. Let's not treat it as something which is inevitably going to come and destroy workers. It's only going to do that if we allow it to, and that really comes back to the whole political power question. It comes back to the question of how we force our governments to use what is available in a way that benefits people. Yeah?
Just a minute. We have a question.
Oh.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, there's a question like there's two sets of people. First is the people who are power hunger, the people mostly towards politics, and the people who are holding towards the economist side, like business, entrepreneurs people. They mostly consider the money aspect and the power aspect. And we are social beings. And we respect and we are concerned about other people. But those people aren't. And the first question is this: so would this ever change? And the second question is, the US is the power after all the economy shifted to dollars. And it's been severe times, and this is a cycle of recession and inflation and recession. This happens every time, and there's a cycle of it. So these people who are in power, they try to curb the countries which are in the developing stage. It always happens. Do you think would it ever change, ever or ever?
Don't be so depressed. It's not. Of course, these things change. It's never. Look, for heaven's sake, India was a colony for 200 years, right? Was it ever and ever? I mean, you're saying yes, the people in power and globally and internationally, they're doing terrible things. Sure, they did much worse things in the past. I mean, they had slavery, for God's sake. They went and, colonized entire countries and grabbed people and made them slaves. I mean, they did really bad stuff. Did these things change? Yes. So, it's not that it's inevitable and it's just going to be horrible the whole way through. Yes, these things change, and history actually allows much more scope for progress than you can sometimes think. I mean, I agree. Sometimes you look around and you say, oh my God, this world is so terrible, and, our society has become so terrible. But, okay, apropos this, I had a teacher in Cambridge. Her name was Joan Robinson. She was a very famous economist. And she used to visit India often. And she came back from one of her many trips to India, and she said, one thing you can say about India. Whatever you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So just remember that. Yes, there are terrible things happening in India, but there are also great things happening. Yeah? And so we have to keep hoping that the great things actually can beat the terrible things. And it's happened in the past. It's not that it's never happened. It's happened even in the recent past. Yeah. Okay, there was a young woman, yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. You talked about the volatility of the financial market due to the capital outflow, especially during the adverse situation like the 2008 financial crisis and recently during the COVID-19. Do you think in present time it is possible to go back to financial deglobalization?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think it's not just possible, I think it's happening, and I think we need more of it. Profiteering, was it so obvious? Yeah, it was incredibly obvious. And in fact, even President Biden in the US, President Biden actually said so at the beginning of 2022. He said, why are you making all these profits from this? So it was obvious that they were making. But then I won't blame the companies, because that's, look, the purpose of a company is to make profit. You know, so you're telling the company to become something else if it doesn't make. What should be happening is that the government should be regulating it, saying, no, you can't do it. You can't raise the price beyond so much, at least for petrol. Or if you're going to raise it, then I will tax all of your profit away. And it's easy, the government can do it. So it's very foolish for President Biden to go and say, oh, it's very bad, you shouldn't do this, when he can stop them doing it, right? So that's the first part. The optimism in the stock market, a lot of it is also self-serving, right? I mean, these are guys who want those stocks to rise. So you have to give good news. You have to present it as much more positive. I mean, I think there's a general acceptance now that the Indian stock market is overvalued. It's not just one company's stocks. It's way beyond. I mean, price equity ratios are way beyond what is justifiable, right? So everybody knows they're overvalued, but the ones who are holding the stocks obviously don't want to say so. Brokers don't want to say so. People who have a vested interest in it, they're not going to say, yes, it's overvalued. They're going to say, no, it's wonderful, and India future, and, you know, we're so dynamic, and we have this young population, and they keep talking it up, yeah? The problem with us is that the media also talks it up. We don't have a very objective media, yeah? We have a media that falls for it and, you know, reads the press handouts and reproduces those and also says the same thing, or basically talks up the government and the stock market. And that's bad for retail investors, because then retail investors don't get the right information, if you like. So yeah, that's really what's happening in the stock market today. I can't hear you, darling.
Good evening, ma'am. Jai Hind. So actually, I'm very thankful for this session. And also thank you for brainstorming us with a very unique idea of thinking about the COVID outcome, about the unequal exploitation or unequal economic happenings in the world. I just want to ask you that, is it necessary to also build an economically responsible society in order to tackle all the problems that we are addressing today? Is it that necessary in times of Atmanirbhar Bharat? So how can a citizen or a society, starting from a school level or starting from a college level, as we are seeing many skeptical youths in the society of from 20 to 40 in search of employment, speaking behalf of me and all the youth. So how can we generate a society which is economically optimistic as well as economically understanding from a very young age?
Wow. You know, I think all of you are already obviously much more aware and acute than I certainly was when I was young, so that's already good news. But, you know, if I had a dream, I would say that what I would really want for all young people in the country is to be very conscious of their own social, economic, and human rights, but also very conscious of the social, economic, and human rights of all others in society. I think one of the problems in India is that we are still a very unequal society internally. We are still very class-ridden, very caste-ridden, very gender-driven, very religion-driven. We have too many divisions among ourselves, and especially caste, I would say, is one of those terrible poisons in our society, because it has somehow allowed us to treat many people as not the same as us, you know? And I think what I think for India to progress, we have to get rid of that. We have to get rid of the idea that, that people are not all equally deserving of their human rights. And if you do get a society like that, it would automatically generate, I think, the kinds of economic demands that governments would find it hard to not deliver. The fact that we can spend one of the lowest proportions of income in the world on health. When I tell my colleagues, I'm teaching in the US now, when I tell them that it's 0.3% central government and total 1% is public health, they look at me like I'm crazy. They think I've left out a zero. They say, must be 10%. Nobody can believe it. How do we tolerate that? How do we tolerate education spending of 3% of GDP when countries much poorer than us are spending 5%, 6%? Why do we tolerate it? I think it's really caste. I think the privileged among us really think that the rest of the people are not the same as us. They don't deserve the same rights. Once we recognize that, I think people with voice will make it impossible for governments not to listen. Yeah, just.
Does reservations have an impact on this?
Reservations are, I think, good because they bring voice to people who otherwise don't get the chance for voice. And I'm actually I'm in favor of reservations everywhere, and of all categories. I mean, I want more women, for example, in everything. Because, I have been a woman in a largely male field for a very long time. And I've realized it's not enough to have one woman, two women, three women. You need enough. Then you have enough women in a factory, you make sure that there's proper creche facilities. You have enough women in some other place, it changes the nature. Similarly, you have enough people from discriminated castes, it changes the tone of the discussion. I have seen this in my own classes in JNU. When we actually implemented OBC reservation, the nature of the class discussion changed. You bring different voices, different experiences, different knowledge, and it changes, it enriches everyone. So I am a big fan of reservations. Yeah. I want to thank all of you. It is lovely to actually also be able to see you, but to be interacting with so many young people. So thank you. Oh, wow. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. That's great. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wow. I'm going back laden. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.